Check the treads again, quickly. We move out at dawn.
We push the tanks through here before noon.
The ice on the lake won't hold the heavy armor, sir. We must divert south.
January 17th, 1942. The bitter wind cuts across the frozen plains of Belarus. Snow crunches under the boots of German supply drivers, their breath rising in clouds that vanish almost as quickly as the rations they carry. Trucks crawl along a narrow, ice-coated road, piled high with sacks of flour. White grains destined not for kitchens, but for the engines and steel of the German war machine. Somewhere in the distance, artillery fire cracks, a reminder that the front is never far. Inside the supply convoy, a young driver glances at the faded map on his dashboard, tracing the route from mill to front. Every turn, every frozen river crossing, hold a risk, not from bullets alone, but from hunger, cold, and delay. A single lost shipment of flour could mean the stalling of an entire Panzer division, tanks idling in the snow while soldiers freeze, waiting for bread that may never arrive. Meanwhile, in the Allied command bunkers thousands of miles away, planners pore over intelligence reports, calculating where starvation could cripple the Wehrmacht faster than any artillery barrage. They see the unthinkable, a war waged not just with guns, but with grains of wheat, sacks of flour, and the endless logistics of bread. The simplest ingredient in every soldier's meal could become the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield. From these frozen roads, the fate of armies and the course of the war itself would pivot on something as ordinary and as extraordinary as bread. By late 1940, Europe was firmly under the shadow of German expansion. France had fallen, the Low Countries were occupied, and the Wehrmacht's armored divisions, Panzer units, stood ready along the borders of the Soviet Union. Hitler's vision of a lightning-fast conquest relied on speed, coordination, and the unrelenting advance of mechanized warfare. But beneath the roar of engines and the calculated precision of blitzkrieg lay a fragile dependency. The lifeblood of armies was not just bullets or fuel, but something far more mundane: food. The German war machine consumed enormous quantities of supplies daily. Each Panzer division required tons of fuel, ammunition, and yes, bread, flour, and grain. Soldiers could not fight on empty stomachs, and tanks could not roll without crews ready to endure the cold and hunger. The Wehrmacht's logistics system, designed for swift victories, had been stretched to its limits. Roads, railways, and rivers became arteries carrying not just weapons, but the simplest necessities of life. One missed shipment could ripple across the front, leaving tanks stalled, soldiers weakened, and plans shattered. Across the continent, the Allies observed these vulnerabilities with growing awareness. British intelligence, combined with Polish and Soviet reports, mapped out not only troop movements but supply lines. Every shipment of flour, every wheat silo captured or destroyed could tip the scales of battle. Even the most powerful Panzer units were, in effect, hostage to the unglamorous, invisible web of logistics. It was a war where industrial production and agricultural output mattered as much as the skill of a commander or the courage of a soldier. Meanwhile, in Germany, the economic planners faced mounting pressure. Rationing was becoming stricter, and the civilian population felt the strain. Soldiers at the front were sustained by complex calculations. The conversion of grain into bread, the transportation of flour across icy roads, and the constant balancing of what the army needed versus what civilians demanded. Every sack of wheat carried in a convoy was a tactical decision as much as a nutritional one. By the winter of 1941 to 42, it was clear Germany's conquest could advance only as far as its supply lines allowed. As the Wehrmacht prepared for Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union, these fragile links would be put to the ultimate test. The harsh Russian winter, long supply routes, and the vastness of the Soviet interior would strain logistics like never before. Armies could capture cities, but without bread, they could not hold them. Tanks could cross rivers and crush defenses, but crews weakened by hunger risked stalling. The stage was set for a confrontation where the simplest elements, wheat, flour, bread, could determine the fate of entire divisions. The delicate balance between conquest and supply was already tipping, and few within Germany truly understood how quickly an army could be undone by the failure of its most basic provisions. From this moment, food was no longer a background necessity. It became a weapon, a strategy, and a silent force capable of shaping battles even before a single shot was fired. By the winter of 1941, Germany's war economy was a carefully orchestrated web of production, transportation, and rationing. Flour mills operated at maximum capacity, wheat shipments were scheduled down to the hour, and supply trains snaked across occupied Europe carrying not only weapons and fuel, but the lifeblood of soldiers, bread. For the Wehrmacht, bread was more than food. It was morale, endurance, and ultimately combat effectiveness. Without it, even the most disciplined units risked collapse. The German army relied on a rigid logistics hierarchy. From provincial mills to central depots, supplies moved along a combination of rail, river barges, and overland convoys. Each stage carried risk: snow-blocked roads, partisans ambushing trains, or miscalculations in timing could disrupt the flow. In occupied Poland and the Soviet territories, local populations were often forced to feed the army, a practice that strained communities and created resentment. Every loaf of bread delivered to a frontline unit was a triumph of planning, coordination, and brute persistence. Rationing became an intricate art, A frontline soldier might receive 600 grams of bread per day, alongside limited meat, potatoes, and canned goods. Panzer crews, facing extreme cold and grueling marches, required even more calories, and yet their supplies were vulnerable to disruption. Factories producing tanks depended on workers who needed sustenance to maintain output. If the mills slowed, if convoys stalled, or if winter blocked transport routes, production could falter, delaying entire offensives. In effect, the German military was a giant organism whose circulatory system was flour and grain, whose heartbeat depended on bakeries and supply lines rather than artillery alone. The Allies, particularly Britain and the Soviet Union, observed these vulnerabilities with keen interest. Intelligence reports detailed ration levels, mill capacities, and the limits of railway transport. In Britain, strategists recognized a rare opportunity: the Wehrmacht's strength, the relentless mobility of its armored divisions, was entirely dependent on logistics that could be targeted indirectly. Disrupting supplies, capturing or destroying depots, or forcing diversions could cripple units without a single tank needing to be destroyed. It was unconventional, invisible warfare, targeting the mundane to shape the monumental. Meanwhile, German commanders faced growing challenges. Hitler's strategic ambitions demanded speed, yet winter, extended supply lines, and partisan activity slowed the flow of provisions. Officers kept detailed logs of ration deliveries and troop exhaustion, aware that even minor shortages could have cascading effects. Reports from the Eastern Front warned of soldiers freezing, engines stalling, and units unable to advance, not from enemy fire, but from lack of fuel and food. Bread, once ordinary, had become a currency of survival and a measure of operational capability. By the start of 1942, the stage was set for an unprecedented test. The Wehrmacht's logistics system was efficient, but stretched thin across thousands of kilometers. The Allies had discovered a hidden vulnerability: Germany's greatest strength, the speed and reach of its armies, was dependent on something as ordinary as flour. This realization would inform bold, calculated strategies that leverage scarcity as a weapon, demonstrating that in war, even the humblest supplies could dictate victory or defeat. The fragility of supply lines, the reliance on precise timing, and the human consequences of rationing all converged to create a paradox. The German army, seemingly unstoppable on the battlefield, was vulnerable in its kitchens, depots, and bakeries. From these threads of flour and bread, the coming strategy would emerge, revealing that the most ordinary commodity could become the deadliest weapon of all. At the front, soldiers understood that survival depended as much on bread as on bullets. In the bitter cold of the Eastern Front, a Panzer crew would huddle inside their tank, rationing small slices of black bread alongside cans of ersatz meat. The flour that had traveled hundreds of kilometers from German mills to occupied territories represented the thin line between endurance and exhaustion. Hunger dulled reflexes, slowed marching speed, and eroded morale. Behind the lines, the story was no less stark. Civilians in occupied territories were pressed into service, producing flour, maintaining mills, or delivering it along icy roads. Women, teenagers, and elderly men hauled sacks of grain to convoys under the watch of German guards, aware that any delay or theft could mean punishment, or worse. In Germany, bakeries worked night and day, producing daily quotas that had to be transported thousands of kilometers to sustain the front. Bread became a shared anxiety. For soldiers, it was life. For workers, it was duty. And for commanders, it was a metric of control. The human toll was compounded by winter. Frostbite, exhaustion, and disease struck units before enemy fire could. Bread, the simplest sustenance, became a silent battlefield. Reports from frontline medics noted soldiers weakening, morale faltering, and entire units unable to advance. Not because of tactical failure, but because supplies could not reach them. Every loaf represented more than calories. It symbolized the fragile bridge between survival and collapse. 2. Tactical angle. Commanders quickly realized that logistics could dictate battlefield outcomes. Panzer divisions could strike with speed, but they moved only as fast as their supply trains allowed. Convoys laden with flour and fuel became critical objectives, not just for delivery, but for protection. A disrupted supply line could stall an entire offensive, leaving tanks exposed and infantry vulnerable. Allied planners seized on this vulnerability. Intelligence on German supply routes, depot locations, and ration levels allowed for targeted raids, sabotage, and diversionary tactics. The goal was simple yet profound. Hinder the enemy not by direct confrontation, but by undermining their sustenance. Operations that captured mill towns, destroyed depots, or rerouted supply trains could force entire divisions to halt, delay attacks, or retreat. The map of the front became a web not only of battle lines, but of grain shipments, bakeries, and storage facilities. Even minor tactical successes could amplify an impact. A burned railway bridge prevented hundreds of tons of flour from reaching a forward division. A blocked river crossing delayed supply convoys for days. In these moments, bread became as decisive as artillery, shaping movements, timing, and ultimately the tempo of war. 3. Technological angle. Feeding armies across a continent required engineering as much as planning. Specially designed refrigerated wagons, covered trucks, and rail cars were used to transport flour and other perishable supplies across icy landscapes. Mills were mechanized to maximize output, often operating round the clock, powered by steam engines or electricity drawn from fragile grids in occupied territories. The logistical machinery extended beyond mills and transport. Planning software, rudimentary by modern standards, but meticulous in detail, tracked consumption rates, convoy schedules, and depot capacities. Telegraphs and radio signals relayed urgent updates when delays occurred. Engineers developed storage silos capable of holding months of grain, while mobile bakeries followed advancing units to ensure freshly baked bread was available near the front. Yet technology alone could not overcome nature or war. Frozen roads, damaged railways, and partisan attacks could cripple supply chains. The Wehrmacht had invested heavily in moving bread, but every innovation had limits. Success depended on a combination of machinery, manpower, and sheer persistence, creating a tension between the Army's technological prowess and the vulnerability of its most basic needs. For German commanders, the logistics of food were a silent, ever-present factor influencing every decision. Hitler's obsession with rapid offensives often clashed with reality. Armored divisions could not advance beyond the range of their supply lines. Frontline officers kept meticulous records of bread distribution, calculating daily rations down to the gram. Delays in flour deliveries forced changes in attack timetables, troop rotations, and even retreat orders. Allied leaders, in contrast, recognized these dependencies as opportunities. Strategists in London and Moscow mapped supply networks with the same precision as battlefield maps, identifying choke points, vulnerable depots, and critical rail lines. Winston Churchill and his advisors understood that disrupting German logistics, without firing a single shot, could achieve effects no conventional assault could. This invisible form of leadership, guided by intelligence and foresight, turned a simple commodity into a lever of strategic pressure. Leadership decisions also carried human consequences. Commanders had to weigh operational objectives against the starvation of units, the overextension of convoys, and the moral cost of forced requisition in occupied territories. Every movement of bread or ration was intertwined with responsibility, risk, and judgment. 5. Enemy angle. The Germans were aware of their vulnerability, though they underestimated its scope. Intelligence reports occasionally noted Allied attacks on supply lines, yet the scale of the threat remained underestimated. Losses of flour shipments, burnt rail cars, and blocked roads were recorded, but operational priorities often pushed commanders to press forward despite shortages. Tanks moved slower, artillery units halted, and infantry grew weaker. But the connection to logistics was often overlooked until it became undeniable. Allied forces exploited these weaknesses carefully. Partisan groups in Belarus and Ukraine targeted supply convoys. British intelligence organized sabotage operations against railways feeding the Eastern Front. Even small disruptions could snowball. Delayed shipments meant idle tanks, stalled offensives, and opportunities for counterattacks. The enemy's reliance on bread and grain, usually invisible in grand strategy discussions, became a decisive battlefield factor. The German perception of invincibility was shaken, not by overwhelming force, but by the strategic exploitation of something as ordinary as flour. It was a humbling lesson in the vulnerability of even the most powerful armies. 6. Moral/economic angle. Behind the strategic calculations lay a stark moral dimension. Feeding an army often meant depriving civilians. Occupied territories were stripped of grain, peasants forced to provide flour for the front. In Germany, rationing created tension between the home front and military needs. Every loaf delivered to a Panzer division represented calories taken from a city or village. Economically, the entire war machine relied on the efficient conversion of raw materials into consumable goods. Mills, transport, and bakeries were industries in their own right, yet their labor came at enormous human cost. Decisions about supply allocation became ethical as well as tactical, prioritizing tanks over people, armies over civilians, speed over sustenance. These choices shape perceptions of leadership, loyalty, and justice. The paradox was clear. A commodity as mundane as bread had become a moral, economic, and strategic pivot point. In the balance between survival and conquest, the flow of flour determined not only what armies could do, but what humanity could endure. June 22nd, 1941. Operation Barbarossa begins. Over 3 million German soldiers surge across the Soviet frontier, backed by thousands of tanks, trucks, and supply convoys. The plan is audacious. Rapid encirclements, lightning advances, and a war concluded before winter. But hidden beneath the roar of engines is a fragile truth. Every tank, every soldier, every assault depends on food moving flawlessly from mill to front. In the opening weeks, Germany's Panzer divisions advance with terrifying efficiency. Soviet positions crumble under concentrated firepower, and cities fall in rapid succession. Yet already, cracks appear in the logistics network. Rail lines, overstretched and vulnerable, struggle to carry sufficient flour and bread to forward units. Convoys crawl along snow-matted roads, delayed by partisan sabotage, mud, and poor weather. In some units, rations are halved. Soldiers scavenge for what little they can find, substituting raw grain for bread or consuming frozen leftovers meant for officers. By August, the problem becomes acute. Intelligence reports indicate that entire panzer formations are slowing, not from Soviet counterattacks, but because their crews are exhausted, morale is faltering, and bread supplies are inconsistent. Tanks idle in frozen fields while engineers attempt to deliver desperately needed flour to mobile bakeries. Commanders face a grim choice: push forward without sustenance and risk collapse, or halt operations and lose momentum. Each day of delay gives Soviet defenders time to regroup, fortify, and prepare countermeasures. In these weeks, Allied planners watch closely. British intelligence and London pieces together reports from occupied Europe, while Soviet command notes German vulnerabilities. The seemingly unstoppable advance of mechanized units is, in fact, hostage to a hidden enemy: hunger. Bread becomes both lifeline and liability, a quiet yet decisive factor dictating where German divisions can advance and where they must pause. By September, the first critical failures emerge. Units running low on flour cannot maintain their frontline positions. Mobile bakeries are delayed by sabotage and icebound roads. Panzer crews endure hunger and fatigue. Artillery misfires increase, and small tactical victories are blunted by the absence of basic sustenance. A strategy designed for speed and shock begins to falter under the weight of a simple, unglamorous truth: no army however disciplined or armored, can operate without nourishment. The stage is set for a confrontation between meticulous logistics and human endurance. What seemed like invincibility is revealed to be conditional, dependent on fragile supply chains, frozen roads, and the perseverance of men hauling flour under fire. The coming weeks will demonstrate that even the mightiest divisions can be undone by the absence of bread, and that the impossible strategy the Allies are preparing will exploit this vulnerability to its fullest. By October 1941, the German advance had pushed deep into Soviet territory, but the Wehrmacht's momentum was beginning to crumble. Panzer divisions, once symbols of unstoppable force, now faced a subtle but deadly adversary: supply shortages. Flour shipments arrived late or not at all. Bakeries struggled to keep pace, and rationing became stricter. Soldiers reported fatigue, hunger, and frostbite. Tanks stalled not because of enemy fire, but because crews could no longer sustain themselves for long operations. The Battle of Moscow became the ultimate test. German units, poised for a final push, found their lines stretched thin and morale sagging. Commanders noted that entire divisions were consuming less than half their allocated rations. Fuel shortages compounded the problem, but bread, or the lack of it, emerged as the silent limiter of operational capability. Soldiers scavenged, shared, and rationed, yet exhaustion slowed the advance, giving the Soviet defense time to reinforce. Meanwhile, Allied and Soviet planners seized the opportunity. Partisan attacks on supply depots, rail sabotage, and targeted raids on transport lines magnified the effect of existing shortages. Flour stored in key depots rotted or froze in transit, creating gaps that rippled across the front. Tanks idled, artillery units paused, and infantry became more vulnerable. What seemed a minor logistical inconvenience became a decisive operational obstacle, demonstrating that even the most meticulously planned blitzkrieg could falter under the weight of insufficient sustenance. The German command attempted solutions. Mobile bakeries moved closer to the front, convoys were rerouted, and soldiers were encouraged to forage. Yet the sheer scale of the Eastern Front, combined with freezing winter conditions, made these measures insufficient. By December, the Wehrmacht's famed rapid advance had ground to a halt. Entire units faced starvation, morale plummeted, and Hitler's strategic timetable collapsed. Reports from the front detailed soldiers collapsing from hunger, engines freezing, and tanks immobilized, not from Soviet firepower, but from a lack of the most basic supplies. This turning point proved the impossible strategy. The Allies had demonstrated that indirect pressure, targeting the mundane flow of bread and rations, could achieve what massive frontal assaults often could not. By exploiting Germany's dependence on logistics, they had created a vulnerability that was invisible on maps, yet lethal in effect. The fate of the Eastern Front and the war itself was no longer decided solely by tanks or artillery, but by flour sacks, rail cars, and the human endurance of hungry soldiers. The fragility of German operations had been exposed. The Wehrmacht's most celebrated strength, speed, and coordination, was undermined not by superior weaponry, but by the invisible hand of supply. This realization would shape the remainder of the conflict, redefining strategy, morale, and the very notion of what could determine victory in war. By the winter of 1941 to 42, the Wehrmacht faced a sobering reality. What had once been a seemingly unstoppable armored advance had slowed to a crawl. Panzer divisions, halted not by Soviet artillery, but by frozen roads and inadequate rations, now struggled to hold captured ground. The loss of momentum exposed units to counterattacks, forcing German commanders to shift from rapid conquest to defensive consolidation. Tanks that had led spearheads lay idle in mud and snow, crews weakened by hunger, frostbite, and exhaustion. The human cost was staggering. Reports from frontline medical units recorded soldiers collapsing from starvation, cold, and fatigue. Mortality rates rose, and discipline frayed as units fought to survive. Supply officers noted that every day of delay in flour and bread shipments translated into tangible reductions in combat effectiveness. Slower troop movements, reduced artillery fire, and diminished morale. The war, it became evident, could not be waged without sustaining the basic needs of the men who fought it. Civilian populations also bore the consequences. In occupied territories, requisitioned grain left villages and towns starving. German authorities attempted to balance military needs with civilian unrest, but shortages and rationing provoked resentment, sabotage, and local uprisings. Bread, once a simple staple, had become a tool of control, and its scarcity a weapon wielded by circumstance rather than intent. Meanwhile, Allied strategists began to recognize the strategic power of these disruptions. British and Soviet intelligence reports highlighted the links between halted offensives and supply shortages. Operations that had slowed German advances without direct engagement now served as proof that the war could be influenced through logistics. Commanders on both sides understood that victory could be determined not solely by battlefield prowess, but by the capacity to feed, move, and maintain forces over vast distances. In these months, the impossible strategy revealed its true impact. The Germans had underestimated the fragility of their supply-dependent advance, and the Allies had leveraged that vulnerability to stall one of the most formidable military machines in history. What unfolded was a quiet, almost invisible turning point, one measured not in destroyed tanks or captured cities, but in sacks of flour, halted convoys, and soldiers' empty stomachs. As winter deepened in 1942, the repercussions of logistical failures became undeniable. German High Command confronted the harsh truth. Operational plans could not proceed without a steady flow of provisions. Panzer divisions that had once spearheaded unstoppable blitzkrieg advances were now immobilized by the simple absence of bread and fuel. Reports from commanders described empty stomachs, frozen hands, stalled vehicles, and soldiers forced to scavenge from the land itself. The effect on morale was profound. Troops accustomed to rapid victories were now mired in exhaustion and frustration. Letters from soldiers to their families spoke less of glory and more of hunger, fatigue, and fear. Commanders struggled to maintain discipline as ration shortages spread and minor incidents of looting and insubordination became more frequent. Even the most elite units were not immune. The human cost of logistics failures revealed that armies could falter without direct enemy engagement. German industry, too, felt the strain. Factories producing tanks, trucks, and artillery relied on workers sustained by daily rations. Flour shortages and rationing affected production efficiency, slowing output of critical war material. The interconnectedness of supply chains became painfully clear. Food, fuel, and weapons were equally vital, and a disruption in one sector reverberated across the entire war effort. Strategists began to recalibrate operational priorities, often delaying offensives or reducing the scale of attacks to accommodate the realities of hunger and exhaustion. On the Allied side, the lessons were equally significant. Exploiting Germany's dependence on logistics demonstrated that indirect strategies, targeting supply lines, depots, and essential resources, could achieve dramatic effects without the direct cost of major assaults. The psychological impact on German leadership was notable. Hitler's obsession with rapid conquest was tempered, however reluctantly, by the realization that his forces could not maintain the pace demanded by his ambitions. The Allies' invisible weapon, starvation, deprivation, and logistical pressure, had reshaped the operational landscape. By spring 1942, the Eastern Front had stabilized, but the imprint of these logistical failures remained. Germany's advance was permanently slowed, its elite units diminished in capacity, and its planning forever altered by the awareness that supply, rather than just strategy or firepower, could determine victory. Bread, flour, and ration calories had become instruments of war, transforming the mundane into the decisive, and proving that even in modern mechanized warfare, the simplest needs could dictate the course of history. The stage was now set for reflection, a moment to understand how such an ordinary commodity could wield extraordinary power, shaping strategy, morale, and the fate of armies. In the end, the story of bread in the war is a quiet reminder that even the mightiest armies are bound by the simplest necessities. Tanks rumbled across frozen landscapes. Artillery shook the horizon, and yet a loaf of bread, or the grain to make it, could tip the balance between advance and collapse. It was not only the courage of soldiers, nor the ingenuity of engineers, nor the brilliance of generals that decided outcomes. It was sustenance, logistics, and the steady rhythm of supply, chains running unseen behind the front lines. For the men in uniform, the taste of a warm meal was more than comfort. It was survival, clarity of mind, the energy to push forward when metal and fire could not. For the strategists in distant offices, a disruption in grain, a bottleneck in transport, revealed vulnerabilities invisible on maps and charts. Germany, for all its industrial might, had underestimated the fragile architecture upon which its war machine depended. One misstep in provisioning, one shortage of basic rations, could immobilize tanks as surely as any mine or shell. This convergence of human, technological, and industrial forces reshaped the battlefield. It showed that warfare is never purely mechanical, nor purely martial. It is human at its core, reliant on ordinary necessities transformed into instruments of strategy. Bread, a symbol of life, became a weapon in the most literal sense. Factories that once seemed invulnerable could falter under the pressure of logistical fragility. Civilians, soldiers, and leaders alike became bound by the invisible chains of supply, each link decisive. History remembers the battles, the weapons, and the generals. Yet the legacy of these events carries a quieter lesson. Victory does not emerge from power alone, but from the orchestration of countless moving parts, tangible and intangible alike. The war was shaped as much by fields and bakeries as by steel and gunpowder. And in that truth, there is a profound, enduring insight. Survival, strategy, and humanity are inseparable. Even the most impossible strategies are ultimately rooted in the simplest of things. And sometimes the fate of nations rests on a loaf of bread.